Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. Snow fell softly on the bright streets of New York as crowds of people hurried along Fifth Avenue carrying bags of gifts. The town seemed immersed in the Christmas spirit, but for Alice Harper, Christmas was never a time of joy. Ever since her mother's sudden death, which occurred exactly on Christmas Eve 5 years ago, Alice had avoided any celebration. Working as an antiques restorer, she spent long hours in her small studio in Brooklyn, surrounded by objects that told stories of a distant past. That year, however, a peculiar client changed his routine. Mr. Eustace, a mysterious-looking man, handed him an unusual artifact, a wooden box ornamented with hand-engraved symbols. He insisted that the box needed to be immaculate by December 24th. Alice accepted the job, even though she was wary of the tight deadline. With each touch, he felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. Something about the texture of the wood, the almost living symbols, disturbed her. It's just another job, I thought, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. As he worked, he began to notice strange events. First, small noises that seemed to come from inside the box. Afterwards, the light in the studio flickered whenever she opened it to inspect the interior. On the night of December 22nd, while trying to photograph the details of the piece, the camera recorded something disturbing. A nebulous figure reflected in the polished surface of the box. Convinced that her mind was playing tricks, Alice decided to research the origin of the object. After hours of searching through old books and obscure internet forums, he discovered that the box belonged to an ancient European tradition of Christmas rituals. Legend has it that it was used in dark celebrations to invoke a spirit known as the Solstice Watcher, an entity that punished those who dared defy the true purpose of Christmas, reverence and sacrifice. The more Alice investigated, the more signs of danger emerged. On the 23rd, he woke up with marks similar to the box symbols engraved on his arms. When he returned to the studio, he found the place ransacked, as if something or someone had searched the space in his absence. Paranoia took over. Alice began to hear whispers coming from the box, distant voices calling her name. Mr. Eustace did not answer her calls, and the few friends she tried to contact considered her insane. On Christmas Eve at dusk, Alice decided she needed to get rid of the box. However, an invisible force seemed to stop her. When he tried to throw it into the fireplace, the flames went out instantly. It was then that he realized the box wasn't just a cursed object. She was a door. On the night of December 24th, Alice woke up with a suffocating sensation, as if something was constricting her chest. She looked around and saw that the box was on the studio table, but now it was emanating a faint red glow that pulsed like a beating heart. The whispers that had once seemed distant now echoed through the room, forming words she could understand. "Open it." The command was repeated like a mantra, louder and louder. Alice tried to resist, but her feet involuntarily moved towards the artifact. It was as if something was taking control of his body. She fell to her knees in front of the box and with shaking hands unlocked the lid. A freezing wind escaped from inside, extinguishing all the candles and lights in the room. As darkness took over the room, Alice saw something slowly emerge from the box. It was a tall, hooded figure. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its presence seemed to suck the warmth and hope out of the room. "You called me?" said the creature in a voice that sounded like a chorus of 1,000 laments. Alice, terrified, tried to explain that she didn't want that. "I was just restoring the box. It was a job. I didn't know." "Silence," roared the entity. "The box only responds to those who carry guilt. And you, Alice Harper, carry more than you know." Confused and terrified, Alice tried to retreat, but the entity continued. 5 years ago, on Christmas Eve, you made a selfish decision that cost you your life. You forgot about it, but I didn't." Images began to appear in the air around the entity, as if they were projected memories. Alice saw herself arguing with her mother that fateful night, refusing to seek medical help when the woman fell ill. preferring not to miss the New Year's Eve party with her friends. The guilt she had buried with years of excuses and rationalizations now rose to the surface like a shattering wave. I am the Solstice Watcher, and my role is to collect the debts left by the souls who betray the spirit of this time. You are not the only one, but you are next. Alice tried to beg, but the entity seemed insensitive. The environment began to change. The studio became a distorted version of itself, with walls covered in symbols, and the smell of wax and blood permeated the air. Alice heard knocking on windows and doors, but when she looked, she saw pale, blank faces outside, watching her. It was as if she had been transported to a parallel dimension, where Christmas joy was transformed into something perverse. With every moment, his sanity seemed to unravel. She realized she needed to act quickly. Remembering her research, Alice remembered that the Watcher could only be sealed again if a sacrifice was offered. However, the sacrifice could not be forced. It had to be an act of genuine surrender. As the creature advanced towards her, she saw her own reflection in the Watcher's burning eyes. It was a distorted reflection, filled with regret and despair. "I did something terrible, but can I fix it now?" asked Alice, her voice full of fear and hope. The Watcher paused, as if evaluating his words. "Courage and redemption are rare, but even they do not guarantee mercy. Show me your worth." Alice knew she had no choice. He picked up a blade he used to restore delicate pieces and held it against his wrist. "If my life is enough to seal it and protect others, then so be it." When she made the first cut, an intense light enveloped the room. The creature screamed, but not in pain, but in satisfaction. "You're just the beginning," said the Watcher, as he was sucked back into the box. "Next Christmas Eve, someone will be my host. There will always be more guilt to take." The box closed with a deafening click, and Alice fell to the floor exhausted, with her blood staining the wooden planks of the studio. Alice woke up hours later, still on the studio floor. The box was closed again, but now it seemed inert, with no glow or whispers. The blood dripping from his wrist had clotted, but the markings of the symbols on his arm remained vivid, like freshly made tattoos. An oppressive silence hung in the air, and the faint morning light began to filter through the cracks in the windows. She thought the nightmare was over, but something felt wrong. When he tried to get up, he noticed that the shadows in the room didn't follow the normal pattern. They danced on the walls, even without a light source to move them. Then he heard it again, a faint whisper coming from the box. "I'm still here." Alice's heart skipped a beat. She knew the Watcher had been sealed, but what remained? An echo, a curse, or something darker? Feeling desperate, she decided to take the box to the customer who had delivered it, Mr. Eustace. He needed to explain what was happening. He dressed hurriedly and placed the box in a thick bag, avoiding touching it directly. As he walked through the icy streets of New York, he noticed something unusual. The people around him seemed different. Some passers-by had empty eyes, like dolls, while others moved robotically, repeating phrases of Christmas greetings without emotion. Upon arriving at the address on Mr. Eustace's receipt, Alice found an old, poorly lit building. The doorman looked at her with a neutral expression before saying, "Mr. Eustace is waiting for you." She felt a chill when she heard those words. He ascended to the 4th floor in an elevator that creaked with every movement. When the apartment door opened, Alice found Mr. Eustace sits in a leather armchair, surrounded by candles and old books. He looked older than the last time she saw him, as if he had aged decades in a few days. "You opened it, didn't you?" he asked bluntly. Alice nodded, shaking. "I didn't know, but now I can't get rid of the box." "What does that mean?" Eustace sighed and began to explain. "The Watcher is not just an entity. He is a cycle, a curse that feeds on guilt and despair. Those who free him become guardians, but the role of guardian is not a privilege. It is a burden." "Guardian?" Alice muttered. "Yes, the box is now bound to you. Until someone else opens it, you will be haunted by the voices and the shadows. And when next Christmas comes, the Watcher will choose a new host." Alice felt a lump form in her throat. "But I tried to sacrifice myself. I thought that would stop him. Eustace shook his head. Your sacrifice temporarily sealed the box, but the curse never ends. It's a never-ending test, Alice. Each guardian believes they can break the cycle, but they all fail. The reality of his new existence began to settle in his mind. Alice realized that even with the box seemingly sealed, the marks on her body and the shadows around her were a constant reminder that she would never be alone. So, what do I do now? She asked, her voice thick with resignation. Eustace looked at her with a look of pity. You watch, you wait, and you try to hold out when next Christmas comes. As Alice left the building, the box felt heavier than before. The snow fell silently over New York, and the streets were deserted. Alice knew that no matter where she went, the Watcher would always be lurking. Alice spent the next few days in a haze of anxiety and fear. The box remained locked, but the Watcher's presence still seemed to hover around it. The shadows continued to move on their own, and the whispers, although more subtle, never completely disappeared. His studio routine was abandoned, as was any contact with friends or acquaintances. She began obsessively researching other possible guardians and accounts of the Watcher, scouring obscure forums, historical documents, and forgotten books in libraries specializing in the occult. On an almost inaccessible website, he found a post from a woman named Lorraine, who said she had been the guardian of the box for more than 20 years. The message, although short, contained an address in Vermont. It was a long way from New York, but Alice had no choice. She gathered her essential belongings, placed the box in the trunk of her car, and left before dawn. During the trip, strange events haunted her. The car radio tuned to stations she didn't recognize, playing distorted Christmas melodies. The headlights seemed to illuminate figures in the distance, but when Alice looked directly, there was no one. With each kilometer, she felt the tension increase, as if something was waiting for her at her final destination. When he finally arrived at the address, he found a small cabin hidden in the forest, covered in snow. Lorraine, a woman with gray hair and tired eyes, opened the door. Without saying a word, she gestured for Alice to enter. I knew someone would come, said Lorraine, watching Alice with a heavy gaze. There's always another. Alice placed the box on the living room table, and Lorraine looked at her with an expression of disgust. You can't destroy it, but maybe you can do what no one before has. Understand what the Watcher really wants. Lorraine explained that during her time as guardian, she had tried everything to get rid of the box. She's an anchor, a link between our world and his, but he's not just a monster, he's a reflection. Reflection of what? Alice asked. The worst in us, guilt, secrets, regrets. It exists because we created it. Every Christmas it feeds on it. Lorraine's words echoed in Alice's mind. If the Watcher was fueled by guilt, then perhaps the only way to weaken him was to confront the very demons that strengthened him. Lorraine took her to a basement lit only by candles, where a ritualistic circle was drawn on the floor. There is a way to confront the Watcher directly, she said hesitantly, but it demands that you let him in. Alice knew this was dangerous, but she also knew that her life would never be normal as long as the box was in her possession. She agreed, and Lorraine began the ritual. As the candles flickered and the air grew thicker, the Watcher's figure began to emerge from the circle, his fiery eyes fixed on Alice. Did you call me again, mortal? Alice, for the first time, didn't look away. Yes, I want to understand why you exist and how to end it. The Watcher laughed, a sound that reverberated off the walls. You think you can destroy me? I am the result of centuries of lies, betrayals, and regrets. As long as there is guilt, I will live. Alice felt the truth of his words like a blow to her chest. She knew she couldn't destroy the entity, but perhaps she could weaken it. Facing your own mistakes was the first step. I was wrong, said Alice, her voice firm. I caused my mother's death because I was selfish. I denied myself the truth because it was easier to blame the world, but I won't run away from it anymore. As he spoke, the shadows around him began to dissipate. The Watcher seemed to hesitate, his form flickering. Lorraine watched in silence, surprised by the change in the environment. "You can carry my guilt, but you can no longer hold it against me," Alice said, her voice now full of determination. The Watcher backed away, emitting a growl of frustration. "You have won for now, but I will always come back. You cannot eliminate what is ingrained in humanity." With one last bright glow, he disappeared, and the box fell to the floor, once again inert. Alice believed she had faced the worst. The Watcher had been temporarily restrained, and the box seemed lifeless again. But as he rested in Lorraine's cabin, something was wrong. The air became heavy, the candles flickered frantically, and Alice felt an even more oppressive presence than before. Lorraine, who seemed relieved moments ago, began to shudder. This shouldn't be happening. The ritual was supposed to give you time. Alice realized that the box was no longer just an object. Something about her had changed, as if the Watcher's essence was spreading into the world around her. Suddenly, one of the cabin's windows exploded, and the snow outside was lit up with a bright red glow. The Watcher wasn't just sealed in the box, he was manifesting completely. His hooded form was now colossal, covering the forest in unnatural shadow. His previously hidden face was revealed to be a vortex of contorted faces, each representing a soul consumed by guilt and regret. "You tried to defy me," his voice echoed like thunder. "Now they will see the price of insubordination." Alice ran to get the box, but discovered that it was missing. Lorraine shouted from across the room, "He's absorbed her. Without the box, he's free to spread his influence. We need to act fast." But how? Lorraine seemed paralyzed, unable to think of a solution. Alice, on the other hand, remembered the Watcher's words. He was fueled by guilt and despair. What if she could redirect that? "He said he reflects the worst of us," Alice began, her voice shaking. "What if we show him something he can't consume, something he doesn't understand?" Lorraine looked at her confused. "What? Redemption?" replied Alice. She knew her own guilt wasn't enough to stop him completely, but if she faced the monster with an act of courage and real sacrifice, perhaps she could break the cycle. She ran out into the clearing in front of the cabin, where the Watcher hovered like an infernal colossus. "You want my soul? Then take me," cried Alice, throwing up her hands. The Watcher laughed, a sound that shook the earth. "Do you think this will be enough? Your soul is just one more in my feast." Alice knew he was right. Only by delivering more than she herself could she offer something meaningful. She took out of her pocket the blade she had always carried since the ritual. Looking directly into the Watcher's burning eyes, she said, "I surrender my guilt, but also my redemption. Not just for myself, but for all those you have imprisoned. You are not an invincible force. You are a parasite." And then she made a deep cut on her palm, allowing the blood to drip onto the ground, forming a circle around her. The words that came out of her mouth seemed to come from an unknown place, as if something beyond her was driving the act. The Watcher hesitated. The red light emanating from it flickered, as if it was losing strength. The faces on his body began to disappear one by one. The roar he let out was a mix of anger and despair as he tried to resist the force pulling him back. The surrounding snow began to swirl as if it was being sucked into an invisible whirlpool. Lorraine ran out of the cabin screaming, "Alice, no!" But it was too late. With one last scream, the Watcher was sucked into the ground and the clearing fell silent again. When Lorraine approached, she found only the box, now completely burned beyond recognition, in the center of the circle of blood. Alice was no longer there. The snow continued to fall gently across the clearing, but now there was an unearthly stillness. Lorraine knelt before the charred box, unable to look away. Alice's sacrifice had not only sealed the Watcher away, but seemed to have altered something in the very fabric of the surrounding reality. She picked up the box with trembling hands, noticing that the symbols once engraved on it were now erased, as if all the energy had been drained. But what had happened to Alice? Upon returning to the cabin, Lorraine felt a change in the environment. The shadows no longer danced across the walls, and the air was light, free from the constant oppression that the Watcher emanated. However, Something inside her said that this was not the end. Days passed. Lorraine returned to New York with the box, determined to hide it where no one could ever find it. But instead of feeling relief, his mind was haunted by one question. Had Alice really been consumed, or had something else happened? Meanwhile, on the other side of town, something unusual was happening. In a small, discreet hospital, a woman woke up. His eyes, once blue, now glowed with a faint golden hue. She didn't know who she was or how she got there. Doctors called her Jane Doe, as there were no records of her entry. She carried strange marks on her arms, symbols that none of them could identify. But more unsettling than that was his presence. The other patients felt inexplicably calm around her, as if she gave off an aura of protection. One of the doctors tried to ask her about her past, but she just looked out the window and said, "I watch." Back at Lorraine's cabin, a hooded figure appeared one night. She knocked on the door and Lorraine, startled, opened it just enough to see it was Alice, or at least something that looked like her. "I'm back," said Alice, her voice carrying an unearthly calm. But not like before. Lorraine noticed that Alice's eyes were different, as was her posture. She emanated something that wasn't quite human, but wasn't threatening either. "The Watcher still exists," Alice explained, "but now he's trapped inside me. He can't do any more harm, but I can't go back to normal life either. I'm the only one left to contain him." Lorraine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't have to." "I did, yes," Alice replied, "because he wouldn't stop, and because someone had to." Alice turned and began walking out of the cabin, disappearing into the snow that continued to fall. Lorraine knew she would never see her again, but she also knew that Alice had saved the world from something few could understand. On Christmas morning, New York City seemed especially peaceful. Families gathered, children played in the streets, and the air was free of the invisible oppression that seemed to have hovered for so many years. But in a dark alley, far from the lights and celebrations, a small box was lying on the ground. It had no markings or symbols, but for a brief moment, it gave off a faint golden glow before disappearing completely. The Watcher's story may never be told publicly, but those who lived it knew that evil had not completely disappeared. He just waited, and Alice, the eternal watchman, would be there when he tried to return. Before we continue, if you liked my content, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what time you are listening to these macabre stories. Now, without further interruptions, let's move on to the next story. New York was especially cold that December. Christmas lights decorated the streets, creating a disturbing contrast with the gray sky. Rebecca Lane, a freelance journalist, walked through the busy streets of Brooklyn, ignoring the frenzy around her. There was something in her mind that wouldn't let her rest, a score that no one dared play. A few weeks ago, a sinister rumor began circulating in the darkest corners of the internet. They said that in an old abandoned neighborhood of the city, the Christmas decorations on a house lit up by themselves at midnight. It wouldn't be extraordinary in New York, where the extravagant always seek attention, if it weren't for the fact that the house had been empty for more than 30 years. Worse still, those who approached the property disappeared without a trace. Rebecca knew sensationalist journalism was risky, but her career was stalling, and she needed a scoop to save the year. "If I'm going to write something about this, I need to go there," she thought, ignoring the discomfort the story caused her. His boss didn't believe it and just laughed. "You're going to waste your time and freeze to death over an urban myth, Lane." But Rebecca didn't give up. A decorated and abandoned house on Christmas Eve. If that wasn't an invitation to genuine terror, she didn't know what would be. On the night of December 23rd, Rebecca drove to the house's address, an isolated street in the Red Hook neighborhood, close to the river. The biting wind made the car windows rattle, but she tried to remain calm as she parked. When he got out of the car, he noticed that the block was completely deserted. Christmas lights flickered intermittently on the other houses, but the street seemed to be shrouded in an unusual kind of fog, too thick for that time of night. She saw the house in the distance, An old building with falling tiles and a worn-out facade. But what caught his attention were the lights. String lights hanging all over the porch and in the bushes in the garden lit up the place, blinking in a strangely hypnotic rhythm. Rebecca grabbed her camera and started taking photos. She walked slowly to the gate, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The air felt different there, heavier, as if charged with static electricity. When he reached the porch, he heard a faint sound coming from inside the house. It was an old Christmas song with a slow, distorted melody. Silent Night. It echoed in the air, but each note sounded scratchy, as if it were being played by a broken gramophone. "That's not right," muttered Rebecca, but her curiosity overcame her fear. She tried to open the door and it gave way with a long, sharp creak. The inside of the house was freezing, and the decor was anachronistic, as if it had been left exactly as it was in the 1950s. There was a dining table set up, with plates, cutlery, and a candle that was inexplicably lit. But what really caught his attention were the figures sitting at the table. They looked like human statues covered in snow, motionless, with expressions of pure terror carved on their faces. Rebecca tried to convince herself that the figures sitting at the table were mere mannequins. Their clothes were frozen and covered in a thin layer of ice, but the expressions were so real it was hard to believe. She took a step closer, holding the camera with shaking hands, and took a few photos. When the flash illuminated the room, the reflection shone in the figures' eyes as if they were alive. Rebecca backed away, her heart racing. "That can't be true," he murmured, feeling his throat tighten. The sound of Christmas music grew louder. Now Rebecca could clearly hear the distorted lyrics of Silent Night, as if voices were echoing from every corner of the house. She began to explore the environment. In the corners, he saw Christmas decorations hanging, but something was wrong with them. Each had markings engraved on them, as if they were ancient runes. On a nearby fireplace, a dusty painting showed a smiling family, father, mother, and 2 children, but their smiles seemed forced. Rebecca smelled a sickly, sweet smell that made her cough. She followed the scent into the kitchen. Inside the oven, which was mysteriously hot, there was something moving. When she opened the door, a jet of steam shot out, revealing a Christmas cake that seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Before she could react, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning sharply, he saw that the figures on the table had changed position. One of the dummies, the one who had been sitting at the end of the table, was now standing, facing her direction. Rebecca swallowed hard and started walking backwards. His camera fell to the floor, making a metallic noise that echoed through the house. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The house lights began to flicker frantically, and the music grew louder, almost deafening. She tried to run towards the front door, but when she reached it, she realized it was no longer there. The entrance was gone, replaced by a brick wall. Despair began to take over. Rebecca reached into her pocket for her cell phone and activated the flashlight. Light illuminated the hallway, revealing shadows that moved on their own. Children's laughter began to echo, but it sounded distorted, as if coming from a broken record. Rebecca tried to remember why she was there. She wanted a story. Now there was one I could never tell. At the end of the corridor, he saw a door ajar. Behind her there was a bright light that flashed in shades of red and green. Against all her intentions, something was drawing her there. Inside the room, he found a gigantic Christmas tree, decorated with golden ribbons and shiny balls. But what was hanging from the branches were no ordinary decorations. They were human eyes, slowly rotating, as if observing everything around them. At the top of the tree, instead of a star, there was a shapeless figure made of intertwined lights. She looked like a person, but she was fragmented, as if parts of her were made of shadows. "Welcome," a deep voice echoed. "You came for supper after all." Rebecca screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the music, which now seemed to be coming from inside her own head. The fragmented figure in the Christmas tree seemed to be watching Rebecca with an intensity that went beyond the physical. Its form was disintegrating and rebuilding, as if it were an entity made of pure light and darkness. When he spoke, his voice was both welcoming and terrifying, as if he was inviting Rebecca to something she could no longer refuse. "You didn't come here just out of curiosity," said the voice. "You came because you were chosen, like all the others who tried to escape. All who seek answers to what lies beyond the material world." Rebecca stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. She felt the pressure in her chest increasing, as if the very air in the house was being compressed. The feeling of not being alone was overwhelming, and the shadows on the walls seemed to have a life of their own, watching her with hungry eyes. "You can't run away," the voice continued, softer now, but filled with a disconcerting melancholy. "Here, everyone is part of the Last Supper." Rebecca took a step back, trying to reach the door, but her feet were glued to the floor, as if gravity had intensified. She felt a pain in her head, an unbearable pressure, and her vision became blurry. His mind began to get lost between the present moments and distorted images of people around a table, their faces completely contorted with suffering. That's when she realized the figures at the table were not dead. They were trapped, condemned to relive the last moment of their lives forever. The house was not just a place of mystery. It was a space where lost souls met, forced to relive the horror of their last hours, as if they were part of an eternal ceremony. "You are seeing the truth now," the voice said, and Rebecca noticed that the figure in the tree distorted, taking the form of a woman with a sad smile. "These are the damned. They come here every year as part of a macabre supper, and whoever tries to escape ends up becoming a part of history." Rebecca tried to speak, but she couldn't. The pain was unbearable. The tree woman smiled, her empty eyes reflecting Rebecca's own. "Every Christmas someone tries to find the answers. You, like them, sought to understand what was happening, and now what happens to you is inevitable." Before she could understand what this meant, the woman reached out, gently touching Rebecca's shoulder. The touch seemed to burn her from the inside, as if the heat of hell was seeping into her soul. And then Rebecca felt the presence of something greater, an invisible, powerful, evil force. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the gathering darkness. The tree's lights shined more brightly, and the shadows in the room began to move like tentacles, wrapping around Rebecca, pulling her toward the center of the room. Suddenly, everything went silent. Rebecca felt a strange peace, but it wasn't true peace. It was a tranquility imposed by the absence of hope. She was now among the others at the table, a new condemned soul, waiting for the next victim to approach the house. The world around Rebecca distorted once again. She felt her body being pulled toward the center of the room, her extremities becoming heavy, as if she were being drawn by an invisible force, forced to take her place among the other condemned men. The figures at the table began to move slowly, lifting their wine glasses, their faces distorted, their empty eyes fixed on her. Rebecca didn't know how long it had been since she touched the woman's hand, but now everything seemed unreal. She was inside the house, but at the same time, she was no longer there. The tree's lights flickered with blinding intensity, and the shadows danced, forming impossible geometric patterns. The air was heavy, and a feeling of hopelessness enveloped her. But in the back of his mind, something began to awaken. No, it wouldn't be like that. Rebecca knew what she needed to do. She had been called to this home, but that didn't mean she was lost forever. There was something at the back of the room that she hadn't noticed yet. An old dirty mirror hanging on the wall behind the table. The figures around him continued to celebrate, but now their laughter sounded hollow, like distant echoes. Rebecca approached the mirror, feeling the energy around her shift. The reflection she saw was not her own, but a distorted version, a version of someone she recognized but didn't know how. It was a woman with empty eyes, smiling at her from inside the glass. "You can't run away from us," the reflected figure said. "Supper is eternal." Rebecca looked at her reflection more closely. she saw something that left her paralyzed. The reflected woman was no longer smiling. His face was covered in shadows, and his hands were outstretched toward Rebecca as if he wanted to pull her toward the mirror. With a choked cry, Rebecca tried to pull away, but the mirror was starting to glow. The figures around the table began to stir, standing up and approaching her. It was as if the house had taken on a life of its own, with every corner of it fueled by the pain and suffering of everyone who had entered it. And then a simple but powerful idea popped into Rebecca's mind. She looked in the mirror and, with all her remaining strength, shouted, "I'm not one of them!" At that moment, the mirror shook, and the lights on the tree began to flicker violently, as if something was trying to break out of the glass. The figures around the table stopped, looking at her with empty, bewildered eyes. But instead of advancing, Rebecca felt the strength of the house begin to waver. The reflected figure, which previously looked like a prison, now began to crumble, like sand being blown away by the wind. Rebecca felt her energy return. The mirror began to crack, its lines of light spreading across the room. With a final cry, Rebecca reached out and touched the mirror. The wall behind her began to distort. The entire house shook, and a wave of cold, unbearable energy enveloped her. The ground gave way beneath her feet, and for a moment she felt like she was being consumed by darkness. Rebecca's world shattered. Everything around him began to unravel as if it were an illusion, a nightmare that was about to be dismantled. She felt the ground disintegrate beneath her feet, and the cold that enveloped her turned into suffocating heat, as if the walls of the house wanted to swallow her completely. But she was no longer alone. The figures around the table, the former convicts, began to scream, their deformed faces contorting in agony. The shadows stretched across the environment, now denser, more threatening. The house seemed alive, pulsing with the pain of the souls trapped within. Rebecca tried to move, but her legs felt heavy. She looked at the mirror, which still glowed with an intense red and green light, the fissures expanding. It was at that moment that she realized the house wasn't trying to kill her. She was trying to transform it, make it part of her story, but Rebecca refused. She knew what she had to do, knew she was on the edge of something greater than her understanding. The distorted Christmas music that once seemed so far away was now close, almost in his ears. She could hear voices laughing and singing a macabre version of Jingle Bells mixed with screams of suffering. Rebecca concentrated, her hands shaking as she tried to turn away from the mirror. "I will not be a part of this house. I will not be one of your lost souls," she whispered like a prayer. It was then that a gigantic shadow formed behind her. The air thickened, and the roof of the house seemed to collapse. The figures at the table began to move, rising and advancing toward her, their hands outstretched like claws. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, feeling fear consume her mind. But something inside her woke up. With a sudden movement, she grabbed a piece of the Christmas tree, breaking it. The wood, covered in ice, shattered in her hands, and she used the broken branch stake to pierce the mirror, in the center of the misshapen figure who was still watching her reflection. The impact was instantaneous. The house shook violently, the screams of the trapped souls intensifying. The blinking lights on the tree began to explode one by one until the entire room was enveloped in a wave of frenzied energy. The shadows writhed in agony, disappearing into the cracked walls, while the figures at the table faded away as if they had never existed. The house was dying. The evil energy that sustained her was dissipating, and Rebecca, stake in hand, saw her reflection in the mirror begin to disappear. The house was finally being released from its curse. She fell to her knees, exhausted and panting, as the walls around her crumbled. The last traces of light went out, and the feeling of oppression disappeared. When she looked back, the house was gone, and all that was left was a silent, cold street covered in snow. Rebecca was alone on the sidewalk, not understanding exactly how she had escaped. The sound of Christmas music had disappeared, and the darkness of the night took over everything around. She looked at her hands still shaking and realized that she was in fact free. But what the house had left behind was something that could never be forgotten. She looked up at the starry sky and for the first time in a long time felt a weight lift off her shoulders. But deep down, I knew that this wouldn't be the end. I knew the house was gone, but the curse had somehow marked it. Rebecca breathed deeply, feeling the cold New York air enter her lungs. Snow fell gently around them, covering the sidewalk and creating a scene of serenity that contrasted with the recent chaos. She slowly stood up, her knees still shaking from the experience she had just experienced. The house was gone, but something inside her knew this was no simple escape. She had left, but the house, or what supported it, wouldn't leave her so easily. She walked away from the deserted street, trying to understand everything that had happened. His mind was confused, full of images of the house, the table, the figures. Every face, every shadow, every scream seemed to have been indelibly engraved in his memory. And there was something else, something she couldn't ignore, the feeling of being watched. Rebecca looked back, but the street was empty. The building to his left looked normal, with no signs of anything out of place. But the wind that blew brought with it a sweet and sickly smell, the same one she had smelled inside the house. The feeling of being watched didn't leave her. She looked at the cell phone in her hands, but there was no network signal. Nothing. It was as if the entire city had become a strange, lifeless place. Entering a nearby cafe, Rebecca sat down at the table, trying to find some comfort in the warmth of the hot drink she ordered. The waitress, a brown-haired woman, smiled and placed the cup in front of him. But when she walked away, Rebecca saw her turning to look with a blank, lost look. Something was wrong. Something about the people around him seemed off. She swallowed hard. His mind tried to deny what he felt, but he couldn't. The figures in the house, those empty eyes, had become part of it now. The truth about the supper seemed to be spreading, affecting everything around it, as if the curse had somehow followed her. The heat from the drink failed to warm his soul, and the feeling of cold only increased. Rebecca knew something was about to happen. Whatever had been summoned in that house, it was not limited to it. No more. Something was spreading, something she couldn't stop, even though she had broken the cycle in the house. A lady sitting next to Rebecca, who seemed normal until then, slowly turned around. His eyes were sunken, as if consumed by a darkness that could only be seen by those who were marked. The lady smiled, but it wasn't an ordinary smile. It was an empty, malicious smile. "Do you think you escaped, my dear?" the lady said, her voice soft but carrying a vengeful tone. "The house won't let you go. The house is eternal. You carry it now. The Last Supper always finds the guests." Rebecca felt the weight of his words like a sharp blade in her chest. She stood up abruptly, but as she looked at her reflection in the window, she saw herself. But it wasn't the Rebecca she knew. Her eyes were empty, like those of the figures at the table. She ran to the door, trying to ignore the distant screams echoing inside her mind. But when she looked back, she saw all the people in the cafe. Their eyes were all fixed on her, watching her with the same blank expression that the figures in the house had used. The curse had not been broken. She hadn't escaped. The cycle had just begun again. The sound of snow falling softly on the streets of New York now seemed like a distant echo to Rebecca. She walked through the streets, her steps slow, her mind confused and filled with silent terror. The city was alive, but everything around it seemed unreal. People passed by her, but their gazes were empty, as if they were all just shadows of who they once were. Rebecca knew she was one of the last to see the truth. She didn't know exactly how long it had been since she escaped from the house, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The lady's words in the cafe still resonated in his mind. "The house is eternal. You carry it now." And the figures on the table, those deformed faces, were no longer distant. Now they seemed close, always on the lookout. Each day the feeling intensified. Rebecca's reflection in the mirror seemed to distort, as if she were losing her own identity. The people around him began to move strangely, with repetitive gestures and blank stares. but no one seemed to notice, except her. One night she lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Streetlights shone through the curtains, creating shadows that moved like hands. The house, with its shadows and deformed figures, began to invade his dreams. She saw the table, the wine glasses, the empty faces, and the voices whispered his name. That's when she realized that the curse wasn't just about physically escaping that place. It was something deeper. Something inside her was now connected to the house, to the spirits who had been forced to participate in that eternal supper. What she didn't understand on the first night of her escape, she understood now. The house was not a place. The house was an experience. She was a cycle, and she now was part of that cycle. Rebecca knew she couldn't escape this. Not now. Not when the lights of the Last Supper were beginning to shine again in his mind. She got up from the bed, her body shaking, and approached the window. The cold night wind came through the crack, like an icy caress on your skin. The reflection of her own face in the glass was distorted, her eyes empty like those of the figures she had tried to leave behind. She knew what she needed to do. There was something inside her, a difficult and painful but inevitable choice. She couldn't destroy the house, but she could take control of it in some way. Maybe he would consciously become a part of it. Maybe he would find some kind of redemption, or at least peace, in accepting what she had become. But before making any decision, Rebecca turned to the wall clock. He was standing still, exactly at midnight, the moment the house had begun its transformation. The Last Supper was just beginning, and she knew that, like everyone else before her, there was no turning back. With a heavy sigh, she closed her eyes and muttered to herself, "I am the house now. I am the supper." And as New York City slept, silent and distant, a new figure joined the table. Another lost soul, condemned to relive the Last Supper night after night, in an existence that would repeat itself until the end of time.